Welcome back to FND 500 Introduction to Research. Today we're going to be talking about writing a basic informative paper. By the completion of this lesson, you should be able to identify the essential components of a basic informative paper as opposed to a more detailed research paper that we will be doing later. And you're going to begin to put together a project that demonstrates the understanding of these components. Okay, now before we start and move on, it's important for you to read in the Weihmeister textbook before you go through this tutorial. Chapters 4, 5, 7, and 8 are ones that are of particular importance to the background of what we're going to be able to say today. And so what I'd like for you to do is stop the PowerPoint at this particular point and then read the chapters and come back to us to be able to move on through this tutorial. By the way, when you're going through the chapters, be sure to highlight and mark those things that you feel like are important. We can't cover everything in this tutorial, and so there may be material reference there that you will need to refer back to. Be sure to highlight it and make it your own personal guideline for the course as we are going through it today. All right, so you've read the book. You've got a background for what it is that we're going to talk about. Now, we're going to talk about 10 guidelines for writing an informational paper today. Now, they're not as firm as the 10 Commandments, but they are important, and so we're going to go through them one at a time and try to give you a background for how do we put together a topical or informative paper that really means something when it's being read. The first thing that you need to do is you need to start with a concept or an idea. Sometimes you define what that idea is. The professor may say to you, choose a topic and write about it. On the other hand, the professor may define the parameters, or your class may define it if you're working in a collaborative group. In any case, you want to start out with research. Don't fall prey to the myth that it's just going to come to you overnight if you sleep on it. There'll be something there in the morning. Unfortunately, in the morning we may not have anything more than we had the night before. So how do we begin? Well, let's start by looking up something on the topic so that we have enough information in order to put together a basic concept or idea. To do so, you're going to want to dig up a variety of general resources. Now, when I'm talking about general resources, I'm talking about not detailed work like a final product, but something that is a tertiary, sometimes called a tertiary source. Those are sources that summarize what other people have written about the topics. You want to be careful that even with a tertiary source, that it is something that is of good reputation. Most encyclopedias and some general commentaries fall into that category. They'll give you a basic background, so they write about and summarize things that other people have written about the primary source before. So there are primary sources, original documents, secondary sources, those sources that discuss things in some depth, and then these encyclopedias and general commentaries that put together information in a summary form. You'll want to be careful about choosing which materials you use, however. Wikipedia, for instance, is one of those sources that is used a lot, but may not always be the reliable because it is put together by the readers, not necessarily by a research group. And while there are some very good articles in Wikipedia, and you may be able to get some very, very general information, it's sort of like looking at the internet itself. There may be flaws in the material, and these aren't going to be readily noticeable until you start doing some other research. Keep reading until you have a very good feel for the general subject. At that point, you should be able to move on. One general source for doing beginning basic research in theology is to go to the commentaries. Now, there are a variety of commentaries available. Some have different intentions than others. Some were written with the purpose of being for popular reading, and some were written for scholarly research. You're going to want to look at the preface of the commentary you're going to use in order to get an idea of what kind of materials are included within this particular set. Some people will tell you that the newer the commentary, the better. But even just being newer is not always better. Some older commentaries are very fine references and should be used. But it is true that newer commentaries might present newer findings from some of the archaeological discoveries that have been made more recently. They may be able to refer to more current research that has been done, or might be able to talk about different kinds of texts that are now discovered and being used in the translations. Just because a commentary is new or old or popular or claims to be scholarly, you still have a responsibility for determining which one is really the best to use. Remember that just because a person says that he or she is a scholar doesn't necessarily mean that, and even scholars don't agree among themselves, even on what they want for lunch. You also might recognize that a number of online commentaries are now available, so some of the research that you might have had to purchase before, you are able to get right in your home through the online sources. We might want to ask the question, what makes a good commentary? Well, a lot of it has to do with the author and his or her ability to look at the original language and to determine how accurate the context is, or the language is, in the passage, and put it in perspective of other passages of Scripture which also use the same language. We also want to notice whether or not they've taken into consideration the culture of that particular time, because various settings will make a difference in how a particular phrase is translated or used. And sometimes we will look at the commentary and determine its value based on how it deals with the difficult or controversial questions that are being asked. Now, don't assume that just because your research correlates with what you've been taught in the past, that that's automatically the right interpretation. Again, there's value in really critiquing and looking at various sources in order to determine what is the best translation to use. And your commentaries can help you to do this. It is probably time, though, when we're talking about research of the nature that we're talking about, to move beyond Barclay and Wiersbe, to move beyond the kind of information we might use for a typical sermon, in order to minister to those people that are in lay positions, to a more serious type of commentary that really takes the research into account. It may later impact the ways that we communicate our thoughts and our messages, even on the more popular subjects that need to be dealt with. Our third step is to take and narrow the topic that we're going to be using into a manageable form. Lots of topics, most topics, as a matter of fact, have so much written about them that it is impossible for you to summarize in a concise and important way the information that you're going to be researching and discussing. And so you're going to discuss just a part of a topic or a part of a passage that you're examining. You want to be sure before you start narrowing that topic down that it really fits your assignment. In other words, take a look again at your syllabus or the assignment or the topic that you've been given and check to be sure that this is really what the faculty person is asking you to do as you write your topic. In our case, as we deal with this topic on Alexander Campbell, I'm going to ask you to deal with topics of Alexander Campbell as a great Restoration thinker. Now, Campbell wrote a number of things. Some of those are really theological topics and others are not. Be sure that it falls within the category of theological topic if you're going to be writing about it for this particular paper. We're going to write an introduction that talks about Alexander Campbell's background so that we understand the context of the writing that he's going to be doing or that he has done and you're going to be doing. And in order to do that, we're going to have to summarize in a very brief fashion at the beginning that background piece and then move on into the overall topic. But you don't want to take so much time on the opening statement that you fail to adequately cover the basic concept that is being examined. Take a look at this particular diagram and maybe this will help you to understand how we develop a more precise theme to write about. For instance, if we were to just talk about Alexander Campbell, we would be talking about his relatives, his voyage, his journey in his faith walk. All of those things would be included in a general paper about Campbell. There's lots of information there. But if we talk about Alexander Campbell the theologian, we're going to talk about specifically his faith journey, as well as some of the other theologies that might have influenced him along the way. If we move on and more specifically try to come up with a topic about his theology, we might deal with just systematic theology, how he came to the conclusions that he did and how they relate to one another. Or we might say, how did Campbell come to the place where he viewed a Trinitarian thought, and what was that thought? And was it different than others who thought about it in his day? Those are more specific questions that could be answered if we take the time to focus our topic up front. Once we've decided on a focus, we'll want to put together a thesis statement. Now we're going to be talking about this statement in terms of how it compares and contrasts to hypothesis statements for other types of research later on. But in theological research, a thesis statement is the one piece of a paper, the sentence at the beginning or the couple sentences at the beginning that specifically talk about the scope of the paper. How much of this topic are we going to cover? Do we have a position? Is our purpose to defend? Is our purpose to explain? Is our purpose to critique? Is our purpose to expose? We're going to put that into this statement as well, and we're going to talk about a particular problem that needs to be addressed. If we do this, if we identify the problem that needs to be addressed, we'll find that it's much easier to talk about the topic in a way that stays focused. Okay, so you're having trouble putting together a thesis statement. Let's try putting your topic in the form of a question. For example, why was Alexander Campbell a significant Christian thinker? What unique contributions did he make to Christianity, or how does his thinking contrast with others? As you pick a particular topic and you use these questions, you're going to be able to more closely define the thesis for what you're going to be writing. Now here's a step that is oftentimes used in developing the ideas for a paper, and it's called mind mapping. Sometimes it's called storyboarding. In other words, what you try to do is you just try to start putting pieces together. As you do so, you'll just start jotting notes down. For me, I'm afraid it's a matter of just a scratch pad that I keep putting notes all over, and eventually I color code it and divide it out into subtopics by using color codes with highlighters, or check off particular sections of it, or put letters next to it, and I begin to take the different facts and see how they go together and what sequence I'm going to put them in. This becomes what we call a mind map. Others use particular kinds of diagrams, and you may have been taught how to do that. Other people will take and put individual ideas on different index cards and spread them out on a table, and you'll begin to see that eventually some of these pieces begin to fit together very nicely and really help out in the organizational part of your paper writing. Now, once you have your basic thoughts kind of together, then you're going to really want to dig into your research. You probably will have discovered through your initial research ideas that you've come up with some really good sources, or they've referred you to some really good sources that you can use in order to get the most out of your topic. And so go to some of those primary or secondary sources that seem to be better for writing your paper, and make notes off of them as well. One of the things you're definitely going to want to do is you're going to read related Bible passages. It's hard to do theology without talking about the Bible. Theology is about God's Word and God speaking to us, and so be sure that you understand the context of passages within a framework. A good tool for you to use is something like Thompson's chain reference. This particular tool allows you to cross-reference very quickly on hundreds and hundreds of topics. Concordances can also be of a particular benefit, especially if you need help with the language. Just because you haven't studied a lot of Greek or Hebrew does not mean that you can't make intelligent conclusions about some of these words. For instance, if you're dealing with a word like dunamis, which comes from the Greek power, and you want to see that if the other passages that you're going to be referring to use the same concept or the same idea, dunamis, you're able to look in like a Strong's or a Young's commentary, a concordance rather, and you're going to be able to see if two passages use the same word. If they use different words, it's likely that there is a slightly different connotation for that particular translation. And so be sure that you refer to as many of these sources as you can in order to make good decisions about what you're discussing. There are also a number of theological research tools that you can use. For instance, the American Theological Library Association is available online. It gives you references to many other sources and is divided down by topics so that it's easy for you to do cross references. And we've talked about this a little bit within our library section. I want to encourage you to use that actively because you'll find that many of the journal articles are some of your best sources for current information on your topics. Look for other good leads, and one of the ways to do that is to look at the works that have been cited within journals and within other articles that lead you to primary sources or secondary sources in other places. Even at the end of an encyclopedia article, you're going to find that there are a number of references there that point you back to earlier sources. Try to use these articles and their references in order to get the best possible sources for your information. Finally, you're going to also consider using the internet. In fact, today, most of us consider that to be kind of the first place that we go to, but you need to be careful. Just because something is on the internet does not necessarily make it true. And so you're going to want to find the best sources and be sure that you're not just going through the process in order to get something quickly done, but be sure that the facts that you're gathering together are accurate and not just a person's idea placed out there for others to read. Okay, let's ask the question, how do we make these decisions about what's good information and what's not so good information, or less valuable information, or less accurate information? Well, let's practice on a couple topics and see if we can work our way through this a little bit. Let's begin by reading 1 Corinthians 11:5. Take a moment and put this recording on pause and read that passage and read it several times, and then come back to this next slide and we'll begin discussing it. First Corinthians 11:5 says this, "And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved." Now that's an interesting passage because we certainly don't require that of women today within the church. And so let's talk about what that means for a moment. Tertullian, an early Christian author, and a good reference for us, says throughout Greece and certain of the barbaric provinces, the majority of the church kept their virgins covered. So the question that we might ask is, was it just the virgins who were in the church who were supposed to keep their head covered as they were prophesying or praying? Or was it because of Jewish tradition? What does the Jewish law say about veils? Well, we read at one point, it says, "Let not a woman go with her head uncovered." Now, if we're taking the passage in that context, based upon what the Jewish practice was, that would mean that they needed to keep their head covered all the time. And so it was not just a matter of prophesying or praying. An example comes out of the history books. It says one time a person made bare a woman's hair in the street. She came to complain, and he fined the man 400 denarii. That's interesting. Because of the culture of that day, if somebody else pulled the veil off of a woman in public, that was considered a crime. Is this what the passage is talking about? If we're going to do a thorough research project, one of the things that we're going to do is look at as many sources as we can. For instance, does Josephus address this problem? Do the Dead Sea Scrolls translate it the same way as what we read within our scriptures today? What do other church fathers have to say? What do other early writings have to say about the topic? One of the things that you might do that's the easiest is to just begin by reading several different translations. If the different translations read differently, it's quite possible that they're translating from a different version of the Dead Sea Scrolls or something that was found later on. Let's take some time and think our way through this if we're going to come up with an accurate rendering for this particular passage. What does the veil mean in that culture and the cultures of that day? Well, Plutarch said, people pray to the gods with their heads veiled, either to humble themselves or to focus their attention so that nothing will distract them. In that day also, men sometimes covered their heads and sometimes not, but a woman's hair was always to be covered. It isn't unusual, then, that this particular practice might have been thought as one that was carried over from other cultures of the day. Remember that a translation is only as good as the translator and the context in which he or she understands the language. For instance, look at the NIV. It says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, you and I have all seen pictures of Jewish men with their hat on in prayer services, and you think, well, how is this accurate compared to this particular scripture? Well, Dr. Fennessy would suggest that maybe the better translation would be, every man who prays or prophesies with a veil dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesied with an uncovered head dishonors her head. That takes it just from a general covering to a specific kind of covering, one which was used culturally in order to provide a difference between the men and women and how they entered into worship. Perhaps you're saying to yourself at this point, wow, what did I get myself into? Well, let me reassure you that part of the reasons you're in this program, and I believe that you enrolled, was because you wanted to find out how to think about the scriptures. You're going to be given guidance and instruction along the way on how to ask these important questions and how to do this research. This particular lesson is just an opening kind of session to give you a broad brush picture of what it is that's going to be accomplished. But think in terms of how to change your thinking processes as you go through the writing of papers. Don't just assume that because you read it, that's going to answer the question either for you or for others about the importance of this topic. Let's take a more current example and maybe one that's more simple. You read a sermon book, and in that book you read a quote that says the New York Times reported that 81% of Americans belong to a church. Now that we've learned some things about critical thinking, let's consider what kinds of questions we should ask. Maybe we should ask, when was this particular book printed? Usually, books are already 5 years out of date when they go to publication. They may have been quoting a New York Times quote statistic that was already 5 years old, or maybe 10 years old, or maybe 15 years old. Now, because New York Times is generally considered to be a reputable source, we would suspect that they did better research than that. But at the same time, we need to be looking for a citation about when this particular fact was discovered. And if there is no citation, I would avoid using it, because I wouldn't know the answer to that question. Nor would I know who had done the research, what the purpose was for the research, nor would I know what the answer to the question was to what do they consider a church? Is it any body of religious thinkers that gets together? Or is it specifically those that call themselves Christians? Are they evangelical? Are they non-evangelical? Are they universalists? If those questions haven't been answered, then I would be very hesitant about using that particular statement. Now, all the way through your research process, you're going to be keeping very thorough bibliographic records. And these will save you considerable time when we're going through the writing process. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that at this particular moment, because the next lesson that we're going to deal with talks about the SBL reference book that you've purchased, and you're going to be looking at that. However, you should not do your research and ignore the keeping of records. A good bibliographic record should be kept on every source that you look at, because you may want to make reference to that later, and you don't want to go all the way back through the sources that you've read. So keep note cards. A good example of a note card is included here on this particular slide, and gives you an idea of the kinds of information that you will need. Just be sure that you keep those cards available to you, and you'll be using them for the next lesson that we're entering. Finally, we're about at the stage where we're going to begin to put all of this information together into one package. In order to do so, you're going to get your bibliographic cards and the notes that you've taken and pull them together into one place. The first thing that you need to do is look back at that thesis statement that you made originally. And from that thesis statement, you're going to try to organize your thoughts. Generally, if you're organizing your thoughts, you're going to give a little bit of historical background at the beginning, develop the context of a particular problem, come to some sort of conclusions about that problem. You'll probably begin to ask the question, what did I intend to prove? And as you ask that question, and as you look down through your notes, I would say that it's probably 90% sure that you're going to see that there are some bits of information that you've gathered that really go beyond the scope of your particular paper. Just scratch those out. You shouldn't use them. That takes up extra space, and it really changes and distracts from your thesis. You're going to want to look for main points with supporting facts. And once you've determined what those main points are, my particular approach is always to just use a highlighter and give each one of those main points a different highlighted color. Some people will take and put those on different note cards, but I would avoid the temptation to just begin putting things up on the computer and writing them out without having organized some sort of an outline so that you can follow through on it. You're going to also notice that within each topic, not only are you going to see supporting facts, you're going to probably note that there are some opposing arguments. And if you do that, that's fine, because that gives some depth to your research. Now, once you've done that, you may want to sort your bibliographic cards into subject areas. And in my case, with using the highlighters, that means that I'll pull all the cards together that have a yellow mark, highlighted mark on them, and start to write that particular section. Because I may have 2 or 3 colors on the same card, and I'm going to have to reorganize them when I look for all the green markings, for instance, and put those into categories. But I try to usually just put that in an outline form first, so that when I begin to write my text, it flows much easier. There is a piece to this process that's oftentimes forgotten by early writers and first-time writers, and that is, in serious writing, you want to be sure that your points make sense, not just to you, but to your reader. And so you want to be sure to go back and look over your outline and make sure that your points that you're writing about follow that outline. You'll want to present opposing views in a respectful fashion. This is not the place in order to try to downplay somebody else so that you look smarter. All points of view need to be given respect, but one point of view needs to come out as the clear winner. Never misrepresent a point of view with a particular statement that shows that you don't like it just because you don't agree or it's not what you were taught. Be sure that you have the backing that you need in order to come up with your conclusions. And omit any materials that seem to be extraneous and take you off the path. I would suggest that you give it to somebody else to read. Even the best writers take the opportunity to have their work critiqued so that when the final product is put together, it makes the best sense. And so when you compose your paper and put something down, you're going to want to put a draft together. You'll probably want to set it aside for a period of time. I always try to do this, even in preparing something as easy as a Sunday school lesson. I'll try to prepare that at least a week ahead so that I have time all week long to think about it and think about the things that I said. I always find mistakes if I go back and look over a paper that I laid aside 10 days ago or a week ago or even 2 days ago, and I like to have other people proofread what it is that I'm doing. Not because I'm a bad writer or because you're a bad writer, but because we need others to catch those things that we just sort of mentally overlook as we go along. So reread it, correct it, rewrite it as many times as is necessary in order to make it good, and then provide a proof copy. Now, we're going to stop in the composition portion of this at this point because we want to talk about the bibliographic entry part in the next lesson. But I have some things for you to do to reinforce what we've done today. I need to deal with one other topic just quickly. As you begin to write, let's remember that we're writing formal papers here. Even the smallest term paper should be considered a formal paper rather than a letter that's being composed or a note that we're sending off to somebody. We're talking about presenting facts that people will believe, and therefore we should use formal language in the composition of this paper. One of the things that oftentimes happens because we are preachers and teachers is we try to slip into devotional language and develop a 3-point paper that will eventually be used as a sermon or a Sunday school lesson. It is possible that some of the information that you're going to be using will be valuable to you later, but for the purposes of this particular paper, you're going to want to use different kinds of a thinking process. You're not trying to compel a person to believe on a topic because of emotion. You're trying to deal with the facts here. Don't use impolite language. Don't use slang. Use only the professional and formal language that you would use if you were writing out a contract. Don't call people with whom you disagree names. This is not a place for slinging mud, and certainly is not a political campaign. And please don't use incorrect language. For this reason, you'll want to use your spell checker and your grammar checker on your computer, and you may want to have another person read over the paper as well. I oftentimes find that somebody else will very quickly catch something that I know, but I just wrote incorrectly because of the speed in which I was writing. So let somebody else help you with that if you can. Oh, and please, please, please don't use texting languages. I can't tell you how many times we've had things turned in with the LOL and CUs and the short abbreviations that are now used for texting. Forget that language during this time. Save it for when you are texting. Before you let somebody else read it, you might want to proofread through your paper again. Check your flow of thought and check for spelling, grammar, and punctuation. But then, still consider this only a draft until you get the final information in, which is our bibliographic information that we will be discussing in our next lesson. One of the last bits of advice that I would give is to look carefully at your conclusion, your final paragraph at the end of your paper. Be sure that it reflects how it defended or changed from the thesis of your paper. You'll want to summarize your major points and then give an authoritative statement about what you proved or disproved based upon your research. I hope all of this is helpful. I know this has been a longer lesson than usual, but I think that if we work our way through this, we're going to be better prepared for future lessons. So take time now and go to the wrap. Do the assignments that are there. This will be the beginning of the writing of your paper for this class, the first of your 2 papers for this class. So thank you for spending some time here today, and we will get together and review some of the things that you've learned as we go through the wrap process.